We're definitely going to keep this, although it's not our nut draw because we're not on the play. If we're on the play, turn 2 Liliana is one of the best sequences. But we'll see what we're up against here. And looks like some sort of blue-red deck, maybe a Delver deck. Okay, here's Aether Vial. Interesting. Normally you see Aether Vial in decks like Merfolk, for instance. And we may have to be a little bit worried here, actually, about Blood Moon coming out of these various blue-red decks. Although we don't know that our opponent is straight blue-red. We could be up against multiple colors. Here's a Serum Vision. So we're looking like we're probably going to go ahead and play this Liliana on our next turn. Although, actually, now we have multiple Lilianas to choose from. Interesting. So I like just getting the basic swamp here. And the question is, which Liliana would we actually rather have in play? And I think we want to just go with Liliana of the Veil. We can definitely afford to discard at least one land here and sort of see how things are going to progress. Liliana also restricts Aether Vial a little bit in that it's harder for our opponent to be able to do multiple things per turn. Although activating Fairy Conclave and attacking our Liliana of the Veil is actually a reasonable play. Although it looks like this is just going to be a passing of the turn here. And here's a Pestermite. Okay, this is interesting. It almost looks like a Splinter Twin. Perhaps it is a Splinter Twin deck without the actual Splinter Twin, but with a card like Kiki-Jiki as the combo piece. So, yep, this Overgrown Tomb is just simply going to be tapped. Lingering Souls is a pretty good draw. I think we want to... Well, now that we have the Lingering Souls, it's a bit more of a decision, I think. But, so yeah, I think we want to take our Liliana of the Veil up here. We know we're not in danger of getting Kiki-Jiki'd immediately, and we can simply discard our Lingering Souls and flash it back. And it looks like our opponent does have fairies in their deck. There goes a Spell Stutter Sprite. And notably, Liliana the Last Hope is also very powerful against this type of deck. But pretty happy to have two 1/1 flyers for blocks here. And here's a second copy of Pestermite. So it looks like the plan may be, from our opponent's standpoint, to tap down these spirits or to actually just kill us here with a Kiki-Jiki, and that is what's going to happen. Wow. So the Kiki-Jiki is just going to come down and actually just... That's just game. Was not expecting that. There wasn't actually a great way to get around it, because if we ticked our Liliana... I guess ticking Liliana the Veil down would have been better, as it turns out. But, yep, that's going to get us. So let's go to game 2. Pretty surprised by that. Probably could have played a little bit differently. But that was a pretty sweet combination from our opponent. I will definitely say that. Props off. So let's prepare for the next game. We know what's going on. It is this crazy fairy Aether Vial Kiki Jiki deck. We can board in some stuff potentially, although I haven't played this matchup too much, so Scavenging Ooze may be a card we can take out. We want our flying creatures, although yeah, a card like Maelstrom Pulse seems like is a card we can sideboard out. Slaughter Pack seems great here. Still think we want Liliana's. Collective Brutality seems good. Although, I kind of like Thoughtseize as well, just to be able to look at our opponent's hand. Worship is... it's another possible direction. I mean, the matchup on paper seems like it should be pretty decent, so let's try this out. Alright, this isn't a great hand. I am going to keep it. I don't like mulliganing that much with this deck. We have turn 2 Tarmogoyf, and then we're not playing that many lands, so we're pretty likely to draw some spells. And it looks like our opponent did take a mulligan, so we'll see how this pays off. But I'm pretty shocked to have lost that last game. That was pretty absurd. I mean, props off. I didn't think, I was like, okay, so our opponent isn't going to be able to get to 5 mana, but then the Aether Vial in a Pestermite, untap a land, play Kiki Jiki, and that was just the game. So, pretty impressive stuff for sure. So, we definitely don't want this Goyf to get something like Lightning Bolted. But if our opponent's playing Aether Vial, that may make it less likely that that's going to happen. Although, since our opponent's shocking themselves, okay. So, yep. Goyf down in exchange for a Lightning Bolt. And it looks like we're probably going to be settling in for a longer game. But I don't think we're going to get comboed out like last time. I think we're going to be more prepared for what our opponent's doing. And we should be able to set up for that. But these man lands, we saw Fairy Conclave earlier, now we're seeing Mutavault here, so these man lands could be a bit of a problem for us, just because they're going to make our removal spells spread thin a little bit. I don't think we want to fire off a Path to Exile this early, so let's just take the 2 here from the Mutavault. Alright, here we go. Here's Siege Rhino. Let's go for it. Siege Rhino is not going to be easy for our opponent to deal with. Pretty happy to be casting it here. One of the primary reasons why I decided to keep the hand is because of this card. It's going to be super hard to kill with a Lightning Bolt. You can tap it down, sure, with a card like Pestermite, although we drew a Thoughtseize, so we may want to play that post-combat, but let's go ahead and get in there with the Siege Rhino. And we do have to be a little bit worried about a card like Spellstutter Sprite, so I don't think we actually need to cast the Thoughtseize here. For me, it feels better to take a little bit more of a conservative approach. and just pass the turn, even though it doesn't, it may not make a whole lot of sense to some. The fact that we could get Spellstarter sprited here is definitely relevant. And here's a copy of Scion of Una. Wow, all of the fairy hits it looks like our opponent's playing. So the Scion of Una, that's going to resolve here. And we're going to have to think about how we want to deal with it. I don't think we want it to path it immediately. And here's a copy of Sower of Temptation. So luckily we do have double Path to Exile here. So we can fire those off and get rid of the fairies our opponent does have in play right now. So this should work out pretty well. And now we're going to be able to see exactly what our opponent's got in hand. If we were right about playing around Spellstarter Sprite or not. Okay, so it's actually 2 bolts and a Mistbind Click. So the 2 bolts together can take care of a Siege Rhino. So for that reason, I'm inclined to take a bolt here. The Mistbind Click in conjunction with the Mutavault can tap all of our lands, but that is pretty good. So it's not the easiest choice, but I think we probably want to take a bolt. Let's see, if our opponent Mistbind Clicks next turn, taps us out, that's not great for us. Alright, let's take the Mistbind Click. It's definitely the more conservative option just to take the click because it is the more powerful card. It is going to mean that our Siege Rhino is going to be able to be double bolted. But we're able to get our opponent down to 4 while staying at a pretty healthy life total. And our opponent is pretty much going to have to double bolt here, I think, unless our opponent draws something pretty spectacular here, like another Sower of Temptation or something like that. Now, if we hadn't gone with this line, we would potentially just be trading the Siege Rhino for a Mistbind Click, as it turns out. So it looks like the draw step for our opponent was a copy of Fairy Conclave, but here we go. Exactly one of the cards we wanted to draw. Sigarda, Host of Herons, out of the sideboard. Huge fan of this card, and we're just going to slam it here. Our opponent has a Fairy Conclave to be able to block it for 1 turn, but it's going to be hard to answer. And here's a copy of Liliana the Veil. We'll see if it looks like maybe our opponent's going for a Mistbind Click here, though. Which, okay, no, it's actually a Vendilion Click. It was some sort of a click. It's actually a Vendilion Click, so that's going to probably grab our Liliana the Veil. But instead, we have a Painful Truce, which is actually a better card here, most likely. So we're in a Painful Truce for 3. And that's going to draw us into not only a Liliana the Veil, but also a Noble Hierarch. So we can play a Noble Hierarch. And now, with the Noble Hierarch in play, our opponent cannot successfully double block the Sigarda in order to kill it. So we're going to get in, and now our opponent's basically forced to chump Sigarda for this turn. So yep, there's the activation of Fairy Conclave. Expecting to see a block here. And that is what we're seeing. And we could play the Lily, but it actually doesn't make that much sense. I would rather just have our hand fully hellbent, and we can play the Liliana basically whenever we feel the need to. But our opponent basically has no answers to the Sigarda besides lining up multiple blocks on it. So, okay, here's a Spellskite. That's not really going to change the math too much. Two Mutavaults are coming in. That's perfectly fine. We can play a Liliana here now. We actually have 2 Lilianas, which is pretty great. So we're gonna play the Liliana of the Veil and make our opponent sacrifice a creature to start things off here for the turn. And we basically are just going to use this Liliana, the Last Hope, as backup. And there goes a Spellskite. So now we can actually just go ahead and win this turn by playing Liliana, the Last Hope. And we can plus it on our opponent's Vendilion Clique. And that's going to be the game. So, on to game 3 versus this crazy looking Fairy Kiki-Jiki combo deck. So on the draw, the Liliana of the Veils, I actually think we might want to board them out. Just because we've seen a bunch of manlands, and our opponent has these flash threats. So we may not actually be able to successfully use Liliana of the Veil the way we want to. And in exchange, we can board in more discard with Thoughtseize. And I like that, because we want to know about cards like Scion of Una, cards like Kiki-Jiki, cards like Mistbind Clique. We want to know that those are cards that our opponent might have in hand. The Scavenging Ooze is a card we could potentially board in here. I don't mind boarding in 1 copy of Scavenging Ooze. Warship is also another card we can go with. Our opponent doesn't have that much removal, so we can potentially land a Warship and be pretty safe. Though, our opponent's deck could have a card like Cryptic Command in it. Alright, let's go with this. We are on the draw here, though, which is definitely not where we want to be. And we've got a 1-land hand. This is going to be a keep here. It's not a great keep, but it's a keep. But we've got 4 different 1-mana plays, which is why I believe you can keep this hand. But it definitely could backfire on us. So the question is, what is the best way to start this game off here? Would we rather play Noble Hierarch or play Thoughtseize, basically? And I think we would just rather play a Noble Hierarch here. It's going to allow us to set up much better for next turn. But on the flip side, our opponent could have something like a Lightning Bolt. We saw our opponent's deck does play 4 copies of Bolt. And it looks like a Noble Hierarch is going to eat a Bolt here. So now we've got another decision. But I think we actually just play the Tarmogoyf here, because we don't want to get blown out by Spellstutter Sprite. Now, our opponent could have a different counterspell, and that is the case. It's Remand, so that Tarmogoyf is going to be remanded here. And so our opponents basically kept our primary threats off the board. But, okay, so here it looks like this could be it is a Pestermite here. So we'll see what our opponent is going to target here. It's going to be the Overgrown Tomb. We have the option of casting Abrupt Decay to essentially get rid of the Pestermite here. But we're just going to let this resolve. We're still at a pretty healthy life total here. And I think the safest play now is to Thoughtseize our opponent and play the Noble Hierarch. And we see that our opponent does actually have Spellstarter Sprite in hand. And basically a trio of Pestermites. So a lot of Pestermites have been drawn. I'm pretty comfortable taking the Spellstarter Sprite, knowing that we have removal for Scion of Una. And then just playing this Noble Hierarch and passing. So now we at least are operating with perfect information in terms of we know what our opponent has at least before this draw step. So with that being said, we're not super happy about it because it's a bunch of flying creatures that are not going to be easy to deal with. So this is probably going to come down to a close racing situation. Back out. Here's the Tarmogoyf once again. We have the option of actually attacking here with the Noble Hierarch. But I think we're better off passing the turn. And here's a Scion of Una, which is a card we're expecting here. So the Scion of Una is going to enter play here for our opponent. And I think we want to go ahead and fire off Abrupt Decay on this Scion of Una. And considering, I think we actually want to path the Pestermite as well here. We probably should have done this when our opponent was tapped out, but we're going to do it now. We know that our opponent's got two Pestermites in hand. And here's another Pestermite. So that's going to untap Steam Vents. And, okay, so the path's going to run into a Spell Pierce. Interesting. So we can go ahead and Painful Truce here pretty safely, but it's going to put us down to a low life total, but we drew into Liliana the Last Hope. So we can go ahead, play Liliana the Last Hope, and plus on Pestermite, and finally start getting in. So what this was able to do is, even though our spell got countered, it allowed us to have the sequence that we wouldn't have been able to. So we're pretty happy that our opponent actually, as it turned out, did use that Pestermite and now all of a sudden we're basically ahead in the race, but we don't know. We know about one Pestermite here, but we have an Abrupt Decay, so that's not necessarily that bad for us. And our draw step's going to be Murderous Cut, so I like just entering combat and seeing if our opponent's going to do anything. So it is going to be a Pestermite to tap down Tarmogoyf here. So no attacks, but now we can simply plus Liliana and then get rid of this Pestermite that our opponent's got. So we're in quite a good spot. We also have Murderous Cut in order to deal with that Fairy Conclave. So one of the key sequences there was our opponent smartly was able to Pestermite plus Spell Pierce us, which was a nice little trick. But then once we drew the Painful Truce, we were able to... Our opponent was tapped out, and we were able to resolve Painful Truce into Liliana the Last Hope. And Liliana the Last Hope is one of the best cards in the matchup. So since we're at 5 here, it just simply makes sense to use this Murderous Cut to get rid of the Fairy Conclave. So let's go ahead and do that. And there's basically not much besides something like a Dispel that would actually be able to counter that. And now I don't actually mind going down with the Liliana and seeing what we can hit with it. And there's a Rhino, so we can get Rhino back to our hand, crack in for 5, and then follow up with the Rhino. And that's probably going to actually put the cap on this game. So I guess our opponent could draw something like a Sower of Temptation here. But this is going to put us, and that's going to be